Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to today's panel. My name is Peter Gerlach. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of international studies at the University of Iowa. And I want to first say thank you to our panelists sitting here with me today. First, I want to say to each of you, thank you very much for making the time to be here. I was, to some extent, very happily surprised that you all were able to make it. You have very busy schedules, and to get us all together on the stage in the middle of Tuesday afternoon, thank you very much. So to introduce everybody, on the far end, Joan VandenBerg from the Iowa City School District. She's the Youth and Family Development Coordinator. Next to her, Susan Mims, one of the counselors here in the city of Iowa City. Next to her, Geoff Fruin, the city of Iowa City city manager. Next, Jody Matherly, the city of Iowa City chief of police. And to my left, Rod Sullivan, the chair of the Johnson County Board of Supervisors. Again, thank you to all of you for being here today. This panel is a part of a new service learning course that I'm teaching this semester. The course is called Community Engaged Learning with Refugees and Immigrants in Iowa. The students in the class who are here in the audience today learn from and with our community partner, the Refugee and Immigrant Association, an Iowa City-based NGO. Over the course of the term, in small groups, the students serve as consultants and trusted advisors. They will write a report on one aspect of the RIA's mission and work, and then on the last day they'll present their findings to the RIA, explaining how their findings might strengthen the organization's very important work in our community. Today's panel is important because we, as a class and as the larger group here together, gain insights into how members of our community's leadership work with NGOs like the Refugee and Immigrant Association and others to welcome and support refugees and immigrants in the area. So thank you all for being here to join us for this conversation. And I'm actually hoping, Geoff, if you might, at least for a quick moment, be willing to introduce us to the space that we're in and what generally takes place here, as not all in the audience may have been in such a space like this one.
Sure. Again, I'm Geoff Fruin. I'm the city manager here, and welcome to City Hall. You are in the council chambers we call Emma Harvett Hall. The council chambers are where the city council comes to meet. We meet twice a month on a regular basis here, and the city council, including Councilor Mims here, meets to set city policy, approve contracts, and take care of other business for the cities. All our meetings are public, so you would always be welcome to come and listen to a meeting. We meet on the first and third Tuesdays of the month, starting with a 5 o'clock work session and with a 7 o'clock formal meeting. The room here is often used for other city boards and commissions and community meetings as well. So hopefully you get a chance to visit us again sometime after today.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so I have a list of prepared questions, and then after we have our conversation as a panel, I'm told that there may be a pop quiz for the students.
No, it was just a way to share some data that would be a little more engaging than me just yapping about it. So
it could be interesting.
Quiz optional.
Optional, okay. Well, that makes the students feel better. And then we'll have a little time for Q&A at the end. So I'd like to first begin by asking you, because I have found the work myself to be, on one hand, a very personal thing. So I'm wondering if you all could talk about how do your personal views on immigration inform your professional work. We're here again talking about refugees and immigrants, and your work may not be primarily focused on the topic. But when it does, when it intersects with issues related to refugees and immigrants, how do your personal views on immigration inform that professional work?
Any order?
No,
I'll start
ahead.
out.
Sure.
So from a personal perspective, I've found out in life that, to treat people differently because of who they are or to bully somebody, I never found acceptable, even when I was growing up. Just couldn't stand it. So as I got into law enforcement, now I've been nearly 37 years, that's kind of morphed into my philosophy with policing and with law enforcement in general. Whether it was my buddy on the playground that was getting bullied or some community member I run across today that's not being treated fairly, what you find out is there's people in life and people that live in our community that have an uphill struggle on any given day. And when it comes to immigrants and refugees, sometimes it's language barriers, sometimes it's just cultural differences, sometimes they just don't know where to turn. And so we have to make sure we're very, very sensitive to that and that we address that and come up with creative ways to deal with that. And I make sure that the philosophy doesn't just start at my desk. And sometimes that trickles down from community requests or city council policy or whatever the case is. But it goes right down to the very new officer that I hire and to that staff member that greets you at the front desk. Everybody has to take that philosophy and to really be sensitive to their plight. We remind folks, first and foremost, we are a law enforcement agency and we have a job to do, but it doesn't mean we don't have, shouldn't be compassionate and caring when we carry out our duties and use that procedural justice. That is, the very end, we know an arrest or a ticket or even a traffic stop has a negative connotation. But it's how we get there that makes a difference. And when we're dealing with folks that maybe don't understand our culture or has a language barrier, we better be prepared to deal with that so they leave that situation feeling comfortable and feeling confident in the process. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that's a really refreshing thing to hear from the chief of police. And I think at least I feel that a lot in our community, that it is welcoming. And I've heard many folks describe your officers as adopting that kind of philosophy in their work.
I would say for me, one of the things that I remember even at my age that was really impactful for me was back when I was probably 10 or 11 years old. I grew up in the state of Vermont, which for those of you who maybe are not native U.S. citizens, it's in the northeast part of the country, kind of east of the state of New York, a very white, very rural community. And during that time, an African-American minister and his family had moved to the state. And I believe there were shots fired at the house, there was a cross burning. And I just remember the impact that had on me as a 10 or 11-year-old and the conversations that took place in our household of, how wrong that was, how everybody should be treated the same. It doesn't matter where you come from, what your religion is, what the color of your skin is, et cetera. And so that was something that was ingrained in me from the time I was a little kid and growing up with my parents. And so as an adult, trying to do what I can to make sure that, and particularly as a city councilor, that we have policies and procedures and support in place for all members of our community, and particularly to support those who are most vulnerable is really important. And some of the things that we have done as our immigrant and refugee community has grown here are things like supporting more English as a second language training. We're providing money to Kirkwood Community College to help them, expand their offerings, doing more translation services, social and racial justice equity grants, things like that. I would say hiring of Chief Matherly was a huge part of that. That was very much an important aspect of the analysis of the candidates that we had for Chief of Police 3+ years ago was what was their background, what was their demeanor, what was their attitude when it came to policing, whether it's African Americans, immigrants, et cetera, that not only did they talk the talk, but they really believed it and lived that and would implement that within their force. So those are the kinds of things that we try to look at. There's always a balance, particularly when you start attaching dollars to various things, but it's always trying to look at things with what is the most, everybody has the same human rights and should be treated the same, and try to make sure, though, that we can go that extra mile when possible for people who have those extra needs.
I guess I'll go next. So this is really kind of very, very important to me just as a social worker, because I think social justice and equity is kind of ingrained into any of us who go into social work. So I really feel like it's strong advocacy for our immigrants is very important in a large school district system. So it's individually helping families understand their rights and understanding kind of what their niche in our community can be, but it's also working to change our system. And I think that that's the bigger challenge sometimes, is making sure that we have translation and interpretation services, and that we create an understanding and a partnership between our immigrant community and the educators that work with them, because sometimes we don't know what we don't know and assumptions are made. And I think that it's the way we're going to have an equal playing field, is if we can give them a voice and an opportunity to be involved. So it's very personal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think I'd just offer one thought, and I think everybody realizes that Johnson County, Iowa City is a growing area. What you may not realize is that the international growth far exceeds the domestic growth. In other words, we're getting more immigrants in here than we are getting people relocating from Illinois or Minnesota or within the state of Iowa. And that's really forcing us as city officials to take the time to deeply understand what the needs of the immigrant community are. And it's a really it's a challenge for us. It's an exciting challenge, but we have to evolve our day-to-day operations, the basic municipal services that we offer to meet the needs of our newest residents. And we take that job very seriously, whether it's parks and recreation activities, evolving those to meet the needs of people from different cultures with different ideas on what they want to do for recreation, to bus service, to animal laws. Everything really needs a good, hard review, and that's the process that we're in, and that's exciting. But everybody needs to be a part of that, and we stress that throughout our organization, whether you're picking up trash or you're on the streets policing. And so hopefully folks in the community are seeing some changes, and I'm pretty confident you'll continue to see those changes going forward.
Geoff, I'm just curious, to what extent do you think folks in the community know that fact that you just shared with us, that our newest residents are more international than they are domestic?
Well, it probably depends on your day-to-day work. If you're a school teacher, I think you probably understand it very well. But for a lot of other professions where you maybe don't get a full exposure to the community, you may not be aware of that. I have maps and statistics that I show frequently when we make community presentations, and I'll often get comments saying, "Wow, I had no idea the numbers from domestic to international migration were so skewed."
I would be grateful, actually, if you would mind sharing that information with me so I can share it with the class. Rod?
I am probably a little more free than the other people up here to be a little more political, so I'm going to be a little more political. Mm-hmm. I think that dating all the way back probably to Neanderthals walking the earth, bad leaders have used immigration as a tool. It's very easy to blame somebody from the outside for our problems. And so whether you're talking, a tiny tribe or the United States as a whole or a small city or a big city, it's just really easy to blame somebody else, right? If it wasn't for them, everything here would be fine. It also gives you the excuse as as a leader, in this case, I would say a bad leader, to say, look at them, put your attention on them, not on me and what I'm doing as a leader, but put your attention on these other people. It's, they're the problem. And I just don't think that's almost ever the case. I mean, almost ever the case. You just don't, when you really look at things in terms of what really happens with immigration on this planet, it's not immigrants that cause problems, it's bad leaders that cause problems. And I just think it's a very convenient scapegoat. And just like it happened back in the Crusades and, for hundreds and thousands of years, it's still happening today. It's happening all the time today. So it's unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tend to agree with that, actually. If we talk about Iowa City more generally, I'm wondering how, and anyone feel free to answer the question, how would you describe the Iowa City area, maybe more broadly and in your specific contexts, or even how you see it sort of personally? How would you describe the Iowa City area in terms of, let's call it refugee and immigrant friendliness? That is, what does our community do well, and what areas or opportunities for improvement do you see?
I think I would see on the areas of improvement, I think job opportunities and because of the language barrier for so many immigrants and refugees, one, trying to get through that, but I can't imagine as an adult trying to learn and become fluent in a totally different language, and particularly for a lot of people who are coming from areas whose language is not at all related to English. So, I mean, it's one thing if you know French or Spanish and, some of the Romance languages, maybe a little bit more contact, but if you're coming, whether it's from China or you speak Arabic or some of the other languages, I just can't imagine trying to learn Arabic, for example. And so I commend these people who have come here and are making every effort to try to become fluent in English. But when you have that barrier, that language barrier, it makes it very difficult in terms of the job market. And so that goes all the way downhill to then the socioeconomic status and the opportunities for them in terms of housing and, opportunities for their children, et cetera. And so where I think as a country and as an area with a high immigration population is trying to do even more and more on the English and on the job training opportunities so that people have that opportunity to provide for themselves and their family in a way that they can feel good about themselves, that that they're able to provide those basic needs without struggling so hard.
What would be the council's role in doing exactly that kind of work, making those opportunities more possible?
I think that's a real challenge, and Geoff maybe can address it a little bit more. But I think, one thing we're doing, I mentioned at the beginning, is we're putting more money with Kirkwood. I think we've committed $25,000 a year to supplement what they're doing. I think they've added maybe 75 to add more English language classes. And this is all for adults. The job training, I would say, doesn't necessarily really fit within our mandate, so to speak, but I would say we're open to trying to coordinate with people, and again, maybe Geoff can address that a little bit more than I can.
Yeah, I think for local governments, one thing we've done really well, I think the county, school district, local governments in general here have done really well, is express our values, express our desire to be inclusive and welcoming, but that only goes so far. That's really important. But we need to dig deeper and find those programmatic changes that we can do. And Susan just mentioned a very important one that we're a part of with the English as a Second Language courses. What we've really tried to do, and where the City Council's focus has been, is starting to create programs that empower the immigrant communities or any subset of the population to basically empower themselves, ask the question, what do you need? Because it's hard for us to sit up here and understand exactly and devise programs and policies that will work. So we want to know what works well for you. What would you like to do, and how can we make that happen? So one example is the City Council created a social justice and racial equity grant program. And we put a call out to the community. We do everything we can to make sure that everybody knows this program's available. And we say, tell us what you would like in terms of financial resources. What would you do if you had $10,000, if you had $15,000? And we've gotten some really good applications. And I think what we see is that the folks that steward those dollars, they can stretch those a lot farther than we can designing some government-based program. So I think that's going to continue to be a point of emphasis for the city, is to figure out how to better understand what those needs are and then empower those populations to create whatever support network they need themselves with the resources that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, just let me add to that. It's, Rod mentioned, starts with the leaders, and here we have a council person and a city manager, and at the end of the day, that policy, that 30,000-foot view has to trickle down to be action-oriented to really make a difference. And Iowa City and Johnson County are really good at that, and I'll give you an example. So, when Mayor Throgmorton was at the helm here and came to me one day and said, I'm talking to the people in the community, in the refugee and immigrant community, and they don't know how to get hold of the police. Do they call 911? They don't really have that information. Sometimes they just need a question answered. And we're the ones that work 24/7. We don't charge for house calls. I mean, we still get out. And so we came up with these language cards, and I can pass these around, but they're in several different languages: Arabic, Spanish, Swahili, and we put them in strategic places, be it the county building or neighborhood centers. So folks have that at their fingertips to say, if I have a question of the police, how do I call? And then if there's a language barrier, how do I deal with that? So the second thing we came up with was a solid policy on limited English proficiency, hearing impaired, and not just through our training, but we said, let's put it in writing to show that we have a policy here to increase communications so the community knows we're serious about it and that we're consistent with it. So those suggestions came from council folks, which came from the community and trickled right down to us where it's action-oriented, and again, actually putting those into place for the confidence in what we do. So these conversations are truly something that you don't just talk philosophy, you have to take action, and you have to make it digestible for the community so they are confident with you. So hats off to them having these successful processes in place at the county and city level.
Well, and we do better when we work together too. And of late, I think we've had really good working relationships with the city of Iowa City, but also city of Coralville, city of North Liberty, the school district. And so if somebody has a good idea, we're happy to borrow it. We don't have to invent the wheel. And we've been doing a lot of the same kind of things. So our Health and Human Services building, the gentleman who staffs it speaks 6 languages fluently. Now, you can't always find a person like that, but it's the number of times that I've run into somebody in the building who's holding some piece of paper and just looking at me and kind of giving that international, like, I don't know what to do, and I just say, hold on, follow me. And we walk over to Peter, and it never fails. Peter can communicate with the person somehow. So
Not me, that is.
different person.
I wish, though.
Yeah, but and so it's just amazing to have a resource like that. But we had to specifically go out and find somebody like that and hire somebody like that. And so that was a concerted effort on our part. And you have to do things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, I think in the school district, we have the same issue, because I think there are people who have grown up in the United States their entire life, and I'm not sure the school system always completely makes sense. And so you have someone coming from a different culture, a different country, where schools are very different. I think you need someone to navigate those waters. So in our buildings, we have student family advocates who are social workers who help navigate that. But they don't have very much time, because they serve an entire building, sometimes 2 buildings. So what we're rolling out very soon, we've hired our first one, and we have 2 more that we're working on, is cultural liaisons. And so we have our 3 highest areas are Congolese, Sudanese, and Latino. So we have part-time positions because, it's the funding issue is such that it can't. But basically, it's that cultural liaison who will basically do a series of visits to families to help them understand how we operate. This is how e-registration. We do everything online in the computer, and we actually had an immigrant family last week that said, "What's the internet?" You have people who it's so foreign to them of how systems are so familiar. So they will help explain all these things, and then similarly, they have given lovely advice and feedback to. And I have just one hired so far, but so far she is helping teachers understand. It's like, okay, when you say go to the library, he doesn't know what that means. They don't have a library in their school. So I think it's really important to bridge that gap and understand and ask them, the people who are coming here, like, what is it that you need? And then we're really trying to use those people like John Paul, who have been here for a little bit, who they know what it's like at the Congo and they know what it's like here, and they're the ones that can help bridge that. So we're trying to find what we call ambassadors, those people who can help us explain to them and give some context and some trust. We have a clinic in the schools for families who don't have health insurance, and so there was a Latino man that called our liaison and said, "This woman named Salome called me from the clinic. Is it okay for me to talk to her?" So I think there's a level of trust that you're going to have with someone who's of your culture more so than someone who looks like me.
Mm-hmm. And maybe I can ask this question of maybe one person is willing to field it. Susan and Geoff, maybe I'm looking at you guys. And it's kind of an unfair question. Your favorite
great.
kind, right? Yeah.
Oh, great. I'm glad you guys get to go first.
We get paid the big bucks.
We've talked a lot about Iowa City itself, but can you speak at all to how Iowa City compares to other cities in Iowa? Maybe we don't go too far outside and say, and ask about other states. But are there other places in the state that you think are doing the kinds of things that you're describing here, that have the perspective, the outlook that leaders in Iowa City have in relation to refugees and immigrants?
Well, it's really hard to say because I certainly don't know a whole lot about the city operations throughout the state. I do know that there's probably some good things happening, but what I can say, what makes Iowa City unique is, as a government, one, we really are fortunate to have a lot of resources. We have a human rights office, and we have 2 staff person that work every day on issues of human rights. That allows us to make some progress that smaller cities maybe can't make. But probably what's more important than that is we have such an engaged community, and so we can recruit people to serve on boards and commissions. We can recruit people to help serve nonprofit boards, people that are very driven on this issue. So whether it's government or nonprofits, you've got people all across this community that hold a very similar value system and belief system when it comes to this topic, and that allows us as a community to do more. So I think we probably do more than a lot of cities because we have resources, but more importantly, I think the community does more than a lot of other communities that maybe don't have that shared drive.
And wouldn't you say too, Geoff, the community demands it of you guys too? I mean, they
Very much so.
Yeah, you understand that, certainly, yes. It's a good point.
Mm-hmm. I do, because we've been talking about this in class, and several of our readings have touched on it. The notion of sanctuary cities, obviously a highly politicized term. And I think some in the room might be surprised to learn that Iowa City is not a sanctuary city. And Geoff, not to keep picking on you, I recall when we chatted first about the possibility of doing this panel, you educated me on some things I wasn't aware of in relation to sanctuary city status. I'm wondering if one of you might be willing to touch on that and how the city sees itself respective to that term.
Well, maybe I'll just offer a couple of brief comments, and then the chief can talk about what it means for his department. But sanctuary cities, it's a title, and to me, it's a meaningless title. We are, and our council has been very good about being upfront about our value system. And from day one, any time this topic comes up, these are our values. Let us be as clear as possible about our values. But what's important to the people that this topic impacts, our undocumented residents, is that our actions are where they need to be. And that's where, whether it's police department or any other city operation, we are going to carry those values all the way throughout our day-to-day activities. And so we express those values not only in rooms like this, but in community meetings, pancake breakfast, whenever we get a chance, we do that, and then we follow through with our actions. And I think for the immigrant population here, it's less important that we call ourselves a sanctuary city than it is to have our staff actually carry out the ideals on what many believe that means. And so maybe, Chief, you can talk about what it means for the police department here.
Sure. So the council on a couple of occasions, as a matter of fact, did you send the webpage links that Geoff had sent you for pre-reading it all with the group?
Yes.
So I'm sure you all read all those 75 documents on there, but in a nutshell, there was a couple of resolutions, and a council resolution is not a law, but it's a formal stance of the city council. And in this case, the most recent one was in 2017, where they reaffirmed the function of public safety in Iowa City. I just want to read 3 or 4 sentences out of that because it really sets the pace for what occurred with the sanctuary city label. So, they do the whereas, and then therefore, they said, except as necessary for public safety as determined by the police chief or his designee, or as otherwise required by law, either state or federal law, the Iowa City Police Department shall not undertake any law enforcement action for the purpose of detecting the presence of undocumented persons or devote any public resources to the enforcement of federal immigration law. So that makes good sense. We're going to comply with the law, but we're going to take care of public safety and take care of the very folks that are standing on our soil because the Constitution says that. It doesn't say the Constitution applies to just documented people that were born here. It says if you're on our soil, undocumented, documented, whoever you are, wherever you're from, whatever your legal status, you're protected by the Constitution, and we're sworn as police officers to uphold that. And they reaffirmed that role. But that also got the attention of some lawmakers back a couple years ago, and they started what was called SF 481, the Sanctuary City Bill for the state of Iowa. And basically what they said was, who are you as police chief to decide when you're going to help immigration and when you're going to enforce some of these laws? That's ridiculous. Let's have a state law that intervenes with that and prohibits that. And I testified in front of a subcommittee at the state capitol and said, the proposal you have here doesn't change what we do. We comply with the law. As a matter of fact, the council had it in writing and in form of a formal resolution. We comply with all state and federal laws regarding immigration. We have an excellent working relationship with our federal partners, FBI, DEA, U.S. Attorney's Office, and ICE, immigration, because at any given time, we may have to work with those folks for certain things. But all of us in law enforcement know our roles. The FBI knows what their job is, and they do it well. DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, knows their job, and they do it well. And we know our job, and we do it well, and we play well in the sandbox together. That's never been broken. So, I testified to that and said, at the end of the day, I have to build trust and legitimacy with everybody in my community so they're comfortable calling us and reporting crimes. Can you imagine thinking that there's an ulterior motive, there's a secondary enforcement action if you call and say that you're a victim of sexual assault? How traumatic is that to the person, to the community, and the entire fabric of this state and nation? So, as police chiefs, we make sure to reinforce that that's not our role. immigration enforcement is a civil action. It's an administrative rule. It's not in the criminal code. It's like I would arrest you for cheating on your taxes. I don't have that authority. That's the IRS. So to think that we should take on the front line of immigration enforcement is ludicrous. Number one, I don't have the authority to do that. But it's also not our role. There's an agency that does that, and they know their role, and they do it well. It's up to them. That's not our role. So we try to reinforce that. They came out with the law, and at the end of the day, the law said, well, you can't prohibit your officers from arresting somebody and asking their immigration status. And we don't prohibit that. We comply with the law. What we do train our officers to do and remind them is that really doesn't serve a purpose on where the person's from. We really don't care. At the end of the day, we have to make that arrest. We make the arrest, to reduce crime and violent crime. But asking their immigration status gets us nowhere. So the officers, by desire to do a good job and treat everybody equally and achieve the trust that we're trying to earn with the entire community, so you'll call us and report crimes, it's so important so we can protect you, they don't ask that. So they're doing it right. The law hasn't changed anything at all. They did the sanctuary city, state law, the 481. It didn't change anything. So at the end of the day, we're still complying with the law. We always have, and we always will. And I think that's an important, piece to put in there. Again, like Geoff said, the sanctuary city is not a legal designation or anything else. It's a term that gets thrown out there, but it doesn't have a lot of meaning behind it.
Yeah, I would say from the city council's perspective, when we were debating this, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that there is no technical definition of what is a sanctuary city. So what would it mean if we officially called ourselves a sanctuary city? Because there's no specific definition of what that means. Secondly, I think we made a very conscious decision because of the politics and the potential ramifications of action from the state and or the federal government to not use that terminology, but to express our values and how we believe people should be treated and how we want our staff to treat people, et cetera. And as Geoff said, we promote that all the time and felt that we could do more good by promoting that than by sticking a certain name, tagging ourselves with a certain name that, one, doesn't have a specific definition, and two, could bring us a lot of negative attention from other governmental agencies.
One of the things that we did together, the governments
yes.
up here, was the Community ID program a few years ago. So this is an example of what one looks like. And I think the people originally who had this idea went to the city of Iowa City first and said, you should do this. And as it turned out, people don't just stay in Iowa City. They, for one thing, a lot of the mobile home parks are outside of the city limits. You might work in Coralville but live in Iowa City, or vice versa, or North Liberty. And so we realized we needed to do something a little broader, so the county actually administers it. But it came about largely because of what Jody talked about. We had lots of examples. I heard from he's not a sheriff's deputy anymore, but a gentleman who used to be a sheriff's deputy who came across a woman who had clearly been beaten. She had a bloody face, and she would not talk to him about what had happened, because clearly there was some sort of concern for either her or somebody in her house about immigration status. So she just wasn't going to talk. And so that means, there are people who are victims that don't get justice when they're afraid of that kind of thing. And so hopefully this card has helped a little bit to build some of that trust between law enforcement that Jody has talked about. And, I wish it was going bigger than it is. I think we've got something like 1,100 of them out there. I wish we had twice that many, but we don't. So you can spread the word if you'd like.
Would you tell us a little bit more, Rod, about the card and how one would get it and what one can do with it?
All you have to do is come down to the county building during business hours and ask for it. There have been some occasions where we've done some outreach with it and taken it out to a couple of the schools and Center for Worker Justice and a couple places like that. But typically you just come down to the county building during business hours. And I think it's about $10. I don't know exactly how much it costs, but You get your photo taken, you have to provide information. So you have to provide some kind of documentation of who you are, but it's not necessarily the same things that you would need to get like a driver's license in America. That's what's tripping a lot of people up. And so we also have a lot of people who walk around with their passports, which isn't a very safe thing to do. And so this way you could keep your passport safely at home and just have this ID. Banks take it, pharmacies, any place where you might have to show ID pretty much uses it. You can't use it for alcohol or cigarettes, but just about everything else.
This seems like a great partnership with certainly some of the offices, departments represented at this table. Would you mind sharing with us some other examples of how you all here at this table or with others that you can cite have collaborated to make Iowa City a more welcoming and inviting place for folks, particularly those international newcomers, to live? I'm wondering too about the schools and what partnerships you've had in the area.
And it's all about partners, honestly. And I
Yeah.
think one of the things that has been really beneficial is there's a coalition of people who are trying to help refugees and immigrants. And so all of the entities up here have been represented in the Refugee Alliance. And I think because it's so scattered, we have so many different cultures represented and so many different organizations that it's important to try to put some kind of organization to that. So we try to have members of that group. Jean Paul is attending that, as well as other immigrant groups, the Sudanese Association, and some of our AmeriCorps who are from different cultures, to just talk about what are the resources, what are issues, what can we do. Mayor Throgmorton was involved with that quite a bit, Lynette Jacoby from the county. So I think that kind of coordination is really important, and especially when you have voices of the immigrants there, it's critical. Other partnerships, I think sometimes just meeting some of the basic needs that we see. Because I think when your earlier question, how friendly are we? I think the will is there. It's just there's the way. And I think when you have bad public policy at a federal level, you have families in pretty desperate situations that we are just trying to pull together as best we can to meet some basic needs.
And the Refugee Alliance that you mentioned meets monthly at Iowa City Compassion.
Right.
And I've been myself, and seems to be a really great outlet for those to learn more about the issues that matter, that truly matter. Conversations do happen there, and folks are able to, I think more recently they've invited folks to give presentations on various topics. For example, when I was there in December, there was a presentation given about transportation in the area and how to increase accommodations for folks who rely on public transportation. I think many of us take for granted the fact that we get around by our personal vehicle. Well, that's simply not the case for many others. And this, I don't recall how long ago it was started, but seems to be a very good forum for discussion of these kinds of topics.
Well, and on that's another good example. So it was Kelly, who works for the county, that did the presentation on transportation. So she's going to work with my cultural liaison to take a group of Latino families and teach them how to ride the bus. Because there's a bus, but then understanding the schedule and being able to figure all of that out is important. The other thing about the Alliance is that sometimes it's just really hard for people with inflexible work schedules to be there. So we post it on the website, and so we videotape the session, so then if you weren't able to attend the meeting, you can at least watch it. So.
And Kelly, who you mentioned, is a county employee, but is also jointly funded by several entities as well. So there's a collaboration behind the collaboration, and I'd kind of distinguish a couple of things, and we've talked about them. Susan mentioned earlier, the partnership with Kirkwood on the ESL classes. That's important. At your next council meeting, you don't know this yet, but you'll be considering a approval of a grant for the Sudanese Community Center as part of the next round of social justice and racial equity grants. So there are some direct collaborations like that, but then there's also collaborations that try to just express our values, again, as a welcoming community. So when you walk downtown at certain times of the year, you'll see welcome banners that may be in different languages or that represent different cultures that we find here in Iowa City. That's a partnership between the University of Iowa and the downtown district and the city. When we were redesigning our downtown, we intentionally created our iconic Iowa City signs, our new signs, to have multiple languages to express welcome to the many different people that call Iowa City home. Again, that was a partnership with a number of folks and a direct reflection of some of the feedback we've received from the public and the values that our city council has outwardly expressed.
From a law enforcement perspective, the partners are absolutely everything. So we handle that a couple different ways. We started a position about 3 or 4 years ago called a community outreach assistant, and they work with our community policing officers out of that unit. But this is a civilian position, non-uniformed and doesn't carry a gun, but their job is to reach out to the community in an environment that's not an enforcement action. It's actually, we seek out groups one-on-one, to talk to them and tell us about resources available and tell them about, especially if you're a victim of a crime, what resources are there. It used to be Henry Harper, now it's Daisy Torres, and they do a really nice job of dealing with issues within the immigrant community, particularly most recently is drugs, they've moved here with their teenage son or daughter, and now that maybe their child is into something that they wouldn't have maybe had to handle in their own country. And is this the American way? Is there what do I do? And talk about being lost as a person born and raised here. Come to another country and try to deal with that. It's a double whammy for them. And so we're trying to make sure we're connecting with them and helping them before the problem becomes more severe. One of the biggest things too is human trafficking. We don't see a lot of it in Iowa City. We're Midwest medium-sized town, but can it occur here? Certainly, yes, it can and it does. As a matter of fact, we just finished up a federal case where we arrested 6 individuals for human trafficking that was occurring over a 2-year period. And so we've really worked with advocacy groups. So there's trust, number one, in reporting it, but knowing that they're going to be fully supported. DVIP, RVAP, or the domestic violence and sexual assault advocacies, but also Monsoon, which supports the Asian and Pacific Islanders, and then NISA, which supports the African community. So they, like you mentioned earlier, it's someone that knows me and knows my culture that I can talk to. I will tell you, 3 years ago, there was a little communication gap even between our advocates and the police department, because they have a job to do and they have a set of rules they have to go by and information sharing and that has to be limited, and so do we. How do you connect that and how do we work together? So the last 3 years we've spent a lot of time focusing on that and earning each other's trust and knowing each other's jobs and limitations so we don't step on each other, and because at the end, who would suffer? The victim. And we have grown tenfold and really have done a nice job connecting with those agencies, so the one that benefits is the victim and they feel supported throughout the entire incident and don't feel abandoned. So those kind of partnerships, especially with the immigrant community, has been so important.
Mm-hmm. And it really sounds like there's a lot of intentionality behind these partnerships. And it's really great. It's really exciting to hear, but also reassuring that at least if I'm understanding correctly, what all of you are saying is that individuals in the community who are experts of their own experience, of their own understandings of the world in which they live, and how they add value to the Iowa City community, their word, their ideas are being taken up seriously and thoughtfully, and are being, it sounds to me like, turned into real action and policy, which I think goes to what you were saying, Geoff, about having the importance of talking about our values leading. Would you all agree with that assessment?
I would.
Yeah, that's really encouraging to hear.
There are challenges, though, with that, too.
Uh-huh. Will you tell us about those?
Well, some of the people up here will know the situation I'm talking about, but for example, there are sometimes pieces of religious teachings that were law where people came from, and they are not law in the United States, and as a matter of fact are expressly prohibited by U.S. law. And so sometimes people feel like that's interfering with, for example, their ability to parent children. Well, this is how we could do it where I came from, and now you're telling me in the United States I can't do that? It's like, yeah, we're telling you you can't do that. So there have been, I've certainly heard of a number of things like that over time that, as much as you want to allow folks to bring their culture with them, there are certain things that don't come with. And, Jody talked about the Constitution applying to everybody once they're here. And I think that's just an example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just have an example of that. We were doing a focus group with a group of immigrants, and they said, so when my kids have bruises, we don't want you to call the Department of Human Services. It's like, we have to do that, and we had to explain, like, there are different guidelines here, and different expectations for how you parent your child, and so it was a good discussion, but again, that's where we need the cultural liaison to say, and I think the other example is sometimes even some harassment issues with some of the teens, and how boys and girls treat each other. So there's just some cultural norms that we have, some standards that need to be followed here, and some context and some explaining of why that is the way it is. So.
And I think the key is to have those conversations when things are good. Don't wait till something happens.
Totally.
I don't know if anybody's heard of Orville Townsend, but Orville's one of our local residents here, and this guy's full of wisdom. And so every time he talks, I'm on the edge of my seat. But one of the things he says often is, we're putting things in place while things are good. Don't wait till it's bad. So don't be offended if everything seems perfect, but yet we're still trying to fix it more, because that's when you should fix it. That's when you have to put things in place. Don't wait till something goes south. Mm-hmm. And so these kind of conversations need to be had in a good, positive environment, and not wait until someone's on the receiving end of something trying to figure it out.
To create the understanding,
Yeah, create that understanding up front, and it's a little more digestible at that point.
Again, a very reassuring comment, because it's suggestive of more intentionality. I think oftentimes people can be reactive, responsive perhaps, but reactive. But being proactive is really necessary. And given our conversation today, we can see how, with the number of different areas that we've covered, the necessity as a community to become the kind of community it wants to be, it necessitates that intentionality. And that again goes back to what kind of values does a place want to have. Are there any other particular challenges of doing this kind of work that come to mind to anybody?
I think one of the things this is actually another partner, it's the University of Iowa Public Health is working on a project for mental health services, because in many cultures, mental health is is something that is you just don't seek treatment for. We have a very Western way of thinking about seeking
Yeah.
mental health. And so I think that many of our immigrants and refugees have seen some really horrible trauma, but our system of how you address that trauma is much different than what they're accustomed to. So public health has got this brilliant program that they're rolling out where you train people not as mental health professionals, but just as a low-intensity intervention to help people be able to manage some of the trauma that they've seen. So I'm excited about that, but that's been a huge challenge, I would say.
Yeah,
I think there's also a piece that's worth noting that I think the conversation tends to probably focus on people who come to the United States or come to this community with a lot of need because, I mean, part of why we're all up here is we're trying to provide for people who have needs. But we've also got a lot of immigrants that come here, particularly I'm thinking of like North and South Asians who are doing fabulously well. You know, they've been recruited here by the university, either to be students or professionals, and you know, they're buying expensive homes and expensive cars and doing great in this community. From a financial perspective, there's not anything that we necessarily have to do in terms of a human need. But I still think we have work to do just in terms of connecting everybody. So it's not always just about, you know, you don't have money. I think sometimes we still have gaps there that I'd like to see us try to do a better job of
Right.
filling in, even with folks who don't necessarily, quote unquote, need anything from us.
That sort of leads me to my final question, which is what are some good ways for individuals in the community, including those sitting in our audience today, to get involved in welcoming and supporting new and recently settled Iowans? What ideas might you offer, all of you?
Well, I guess my first suggestion would be, you know, doing some research on what kind of nonprofits are out there and what they're doing. I mean, you talk about the Refugee Alliance, and then you talk about that being kind of an organization of organizations. So what are those sub-organizations do, and what's their mission, and who are they working with, and where do your interests and skills and time, you know, abilities fit within any of those others. I don't know how much United Way has on their website for volunteer opportunities. I'm not sure. But I would say certainly if you have any second language abilities, there's all kinds of people.
Come see me.
Yeah, there's all kinds of people, organizations that can use you if you're proficient in something other than English, so.
I'll be a little more superficial than that. Learn about other cultures. Be sensitive to the habits and the customs. You know, shaking the hand of a female in some countries is considered rude, and so have some upfront knowledge about that, and then understand their plight. The fact that maybe they're not looking at you in the eye doesn't mean that they're rude or condescending. Maybe that's their culture. So, you know, be sensitive to that. Find out that information up front, and be in a position to offer the hand to say, "Can I help you? You know, let me help direct you somewhere." Be it, you know, an agency you're aware of, or just simply being nice. But you know, our culture, our country's young people are in better shape than when I was growing up. They're certainly more sensitive to these issues, and that's a good thing. So continue in that direction. That's my advice.
Others? Advice for?
Food is good. Food is a really good way to bridge.
In what way?
Oh, well, it's just a great way to bridge different cultures. You know, everybody loves food, and so that's just a great way to learn about each other's when you sit down and share food.
Okay. Mitch, you have the microphone. We're wondering if anybody has questions for our panelists. Yes, sir. And if you would introduce yourself as well.
First of all, thank you for your insights. I came from Des Moines. I don't have a question, but I have just an extension of partnership and possible collaboration. My name is Max Cheska, and I serve as the Bureau Chief for Refugee Services in Des Moines, Iowa, as well as the State Refugee Coordinator for Iowa. So if there are ways that we can partner to help some communities
Yes.
here in Eastern Iowa, we are a
Let's-
statewide agency, and in my role as State Refugee Coordinator for Iowa, we also touch every region of Iowa where there are refugees.
Do you have some business cards?
I was just
Okay.
going to say the same thing.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
I reached out to Mark a couple of weeks ago and really appreciate that he was able to come from Des Moines to hear our conversation today. Obviously, we've talked a lot about partnership, and I had a feeling that there would be some good connections to make.
Are we
Yeah.
keeping up with Des Moines? We doing all right?
You get there. No, I studied in Iowa City. Iowa City. I came as a refugee to this country, so Iowa City has always been, the state of Iowa historically has been a welcoming state.
Excellent.
From the early 70s, refugee resettlement to where we are now. I know the climate has drastically changed, but I guess if there is a silver lining in anything, that would be that now is the time to sort of revamp what we have in place, to strengthen the partnerships that we have across the state, to really focus on the communities that are already here, and then potentially prepare for what's to come in November, to see how that will also change the climate of refugee resettlement, but also immigration as well. Across the state, I think things are going very well. Each community, as you alluded to, is unique, and they have their own strengths. But with those strengths also come opportunities of growth and collaboration. So definitely looking forward to what's to come.
Thank you. Questions in the room? I'm looking especially at my students who came prepared to ask lots of really great questions. Yeah. Mitch, will you share the microphone? It might be good for the audio to pick that up too. Thanks.
I just had a question about the ESL classes that you guys were talking about throughout the conversation. You mentioned that you partnered with Kirkwood, but are those only on the Kirkwood campus, or are they held like throughout the city? Because I know transportation is a big issue for a lot of immigrants and refugees.
Yeah, they're going to be looking at multiple locations to host those classes. And what's really neat about this program is it's tied directly into job training. So what they try to do is identify employers to work with, and oftentimes they'll actually do the classes within that work site. So if you can imagine a manufacturing factory, they will bring in folks that do not speak English, and they may work 3 hours on the line and then take 3 hours of classes. And if you can get through, say, 3, 4, 5 months to where they can become proficient enough speaking to advance in that job, then they kind of get promoted out of that entry-level role. So it's really, it's not your traditional ESL type of program. It's very specific to equipping adults to enter the workforce. So I think what Kirkwood's out doing right now is trying to find those employer partners, because there are a lot of people looking for employees right now, and we have a lot of talent sitting here. We just have this one barrier that's massive right now. So this program's pretty unique, trying to remove that barrier and help both the business community and the immigrant community.
Is there a course fee for this program?
I don't know.
Kirkwood, those classes are free
Are
right
they?
now, the adult
Okay.
ed, yeah.
Okay. Is there a question over here?
So we've touched on how federal law affects the way you do your jobs regarding immigrants, but how does state law affect it?
So the biggest piece of the state law is that SF 481, Senate File 481, that tried to lay out, a game plan, and it really hasn't affected us. I'm sure there's some agencies out there that it did affect, but we already had policies in place which it mandated. We already had everything in place, so we were a little bit ahead of the curve on that. Unfortunately, for law enforcement, the state law tried to set us back a little bit. And, if you're good at what you do and you've got everything in place and can balance law enforcement and taking care of the community, everybody in the community, then it's not too tough of a job to still comply with state law. So not a lot of impact there. I think, having systems in place, other laws in place for victims of crime, I was really good at that. And so there are some positive laws out there. I don't want to just talk about 481, but there's some things that have aided us in enhance advocacy groups and social services. So there's stuff in place for everybody. So there's some good laws too.
If I could just add to that real quick, when it comes to 481, as the chief mentioned, not a real practical impact on our operations. Our operations continued as they always have, but the rhetoric behind the law and the attention that law got and the way it was promoted throughout the state very much set us back with the immigrant community. We had to reestablish those connections. We had to try to reassure folks that this law is not going to change anything. And that was hard to do, and I don't, candidly, I don't know if we've overcome that yet. That's a constant work in progress, and we see that frequently. We'll make strides, and then there'll be some state and some national news that set us back, and then we make strides, and it seems like, at least for the last several years, it's been a push-pull that's been difficult. So it's not always the text of the law that hurts. It's the rhetoric that goes with it.
And I'll put a little definition behind the rhetoric side. We've seen federal vehicles pull into town to get a bagel downtown, and my phone rings. What's ICE doing here? Why are they in town? Is there a big raid going on? They're just getting a bagel. That's how scared folks are, and that's real. So this law did set us back. I had a couple phone calls right after the law passed that said, well, are you guys ICE now? No, we're not, and we're not going to be. So we've got a ways to go. It caused some issues, unfortunately.
Out of curiosity, Chief, within the police department, I'm wondering what kind of training or conversation has there been with officers who are, first responders, who are out in the community having interactions with folks or not, because individuals may be afraid. But what sort of, how have you framed this very complicated issue for those officers doing the daily work?
So training. For example, in 2016, the department did a total of 200 hours, not individual, but a total of 200 hours of training in cultural competency and implicit bias and things of that nature. And the year I got here in 17, we moved that up to 1,100 hours. That's how much emphasis we put on it, and that's how important it is, and we continue in that direction. You can never get enough of it. We measure disproportionality in minority contacts for traffic stops and have for the last 15, 20 years. We continue to be our hardest critic and grade ourselves. But if you let up off that gas pedal and you don't continually remind officers, you got a job to do, we want you to use your discretion, you're out there, you're well trained, you're well paid, you're well educated, get the job done. But remember, there's a better way to police. Every single officer that I have working here, and there's 86 of them, are good officers that work hard and want to do a good job, but they're only as good as their training and only as good as their expectations. And so we constantly remind them of that, give them the freedom to do their job, but never forget getting better. And they are so well received with that, and they really do a nice job. So that's important, but a lot of training.
I think that's a good lesson for us all, actually. That much cultural competence training, implicit bias training is, as you aptly point out, good for law enforcement officers, but it's also good for all of us. And when I asked before about things that we could all be doing, certainly volunteering our time, maybe making donations, getting educated seems to me to be crucial as well, and the university has lots of those kinds of opportunities, particularly for students to increase their cultural competence and to learn more about implicit bias. We can't all think, we've lived or studied abroad. We all live in a forward-thinking community, so we've done it. It seems to be a really important sort of a standard for all of us. I'm really happy to hear that that's happening. Any other questions? We have time for maybe one more. Yeah, Anai?
So this is about the identification cards. So say if someone's undocumented, what kind of documents do you need to get a card?
There's a long list, and it depends upon where you're from and what's available. So really, you can call and ask, or you can go down there and ask. I think there's quite a bit of information available on the website, but it sort of depends on what documents are available.
That was a quick one. Yes, ma'am. Mitch, will you please bring over the mic? Thank you.
Earlier, it was mentioned that there's some limited knowledge of technology, and I think the city and maybe even the county requires uploading a resume online to even apply for a job. And you were just saying, you can look online to find what's needed for a community ID card. How's that accessible?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a problem, I suppose, still for a lot of folks. There are resources out there, the library, and you can certainly, like I said, you can also come down. People will be happy to speak in person with you, over the phone.
Call Peter.
Anything works.
We try as well. So when we're recruiting the positions, one, it's making sure that the recruitments are broadcasted widely. And then for those that need assistance, we ask them to come here, and we'll actually have staff walk them through the online program. And the library, as Rod said, there's computers available. They also have programs to help you if you need to put together a resume. We try to offer those types of assistant programs as well.
And in our conversations with Kirkwood, computer literacy was one of the things that we talked about, and if we can combine that with the English classes, because it's a huge barrier, and I think that they're addressing that in some of their curriculum as well. Oh.
Okay, very good. So again, I would like to thank our 5 panelists for participating today, to City Hall for hosting us, and to News Channel 4 for recording today's panel, and the Daily Iowan and the Gazette for covering our discussion. I'll end by saying that if you're interested in hearing more about the community engaged learning with refugees and immigrants in Iowa course, I encourage you to join me at the Iowa City Foreign Relations Luncheon on Wednesday, the 20th of May at noon. I'll be giving a talk there on how the course came together, how it went, what my students and I learned. And perhaps most importantly, what the Refugee and Immigrant Association tells us was most beneficial to them. It is a semester-long course in which we are trying to do our best, as I noted before, to become trusted advisors. And by May, we'll know how things have shaped up. And in what ways we were able to be of service to the Refugee and Immigrant Association. I would encourage you also to check them out and to give them a good look. They are, I'll give them a plug because I'm on the board and because I have the microphone at the moment. Jean-Paul Mugemuzi and his team are really incredible individuals, refugees themselves, who are making Iowa City a much better place and are doing so themselves in service to others who come here to Iowa City, doing the hard work of making a better life for themselves without a full-time staff and without reliable funding, to make a better life for others in Iowa City. Their center is on Gilbert Street, and it's really an admirable organization, and we're, as a class, very fortunate to be partnering with them. So I encourage you to give them a good look too, and to support them in ways if you're able. Again, thank you all very much for being a part of the panel, and thank you all for joining us.